Okay, welcome to our webcast this afternoon, Return of the Economists, featuring Anirban Basu, produced by Impact, the Ironworker Management Progressive Action Cooperative Trust. I'm Kevin Hilton, the CEO of Impact, and if you dare, scan the Wall Street Journal, and you can see the economic news of the day. And today, when I opened my Wall Street Journal app, I was dismayed to see another 2.4 million job claims were filed last week. Retail sales continue to flag. There's extreme frustration with the Small Business Administration over their loan program. So we thought here at Impact it was a good time to allow our go-to economist to provide some analysis specific to the construction and industrial maintenance industries that we're so deeply ingrained in. Today, it's no surprise to you, Anirban Basu of the Sage Policy Group is going to join us. And Anirban has addressed Impact many, many times in the past and really needs no introduction, but suffice it to say that his credentials are impeccable and his delivery of the materials are engaging and certainly unparalleled. If nothing else, you'll get a number of laughs, but I've looked behind the curtain. He has some very deep economic analysis and data provided. Before I turn the microphone and screen over to Anirban, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button and there's a chat button. Please use the Q&A button for your questions. Anirban has generously agreed to answer as many questions as you have during the next hour or so. And steer clear of using the chat button because we typically don't monitor the chat. Use the Q&A for your questions. This recording will be available on our website later on tonight. And as all of our webinars are available on the website, so you can go back and reference those along with PowerPoints germane to the topics we discuss. They're all found at www.impact-net.org. And like I said, later today, you'll have this recording on there as well. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, if you have any issues specific to the ironworkers and our contractors, our valued owners, please reach out to your Impact Regional Director. We have them from sea to shining sea, covering all regions. Those Impact Regional Directors are found on our website under About Impact, and you can look at our map of North America and you can see who covers your area and reach out to them. They are available 365 days a year, 24/7, unless it's leap year, and they're available 366 days a year. And if you just prefer to reach our subject matter experts, be it Anirban or our business subject matter experts, whether it's insurance, surety, legal, accounting, whatever the case may be, business coaching, send an email to careact@impact-net.org, and we will get it to the appropriate person and get back to you as soon as possible. So we've got a very good crowd on hand. We're very pleased to have you, Anirban. I will turn it over to you and go on mute. Thank you, Anirban Basu.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to all the stakeholders at Impact for inviting me and letting me share information with you today. A lot of people to thank, obviously, but one group I have not thanked. I'll thank nurses and many others. The DoorDash delivery folks who are so intrepid, but also the internet providers who have kept us online and allowed us to communicate during this pandemic. So I've entitled the presentation today, Return of the Economist. It is a presentation about the economy. It is a Lord of the Rings theme presentation. You'll see that theming throughout the presentation. This is your COVID-19 economic update. And so I'll try to share with you the latest and greatest data regarding where we are in this cycle and also what the shape of the recovery to come is likely to be. Lots of ways to start a webinar. Could recite the Pledge of Allegiance, prayer, maybe the national anthem, but I'm going to start out with the ring verse. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness find them. You will see this organizational framework throughout this webinar: 9, 7, 3, 1, 9 rings for the kingdom of men and women, 7 for the dwarves, 3 for the elves, 1 for the dark lord. The dark lord has been busy. Very active in 2020. This is global cumulative confirmed cases, January 22nd through May 18th. You can see that beginning of the year, we were basically at 0 cases, and we had a few obviously in Wuhan province, China, so on and so forth, but that's changed, and we now have millions of cases. Good news here, we're flattening the curve. Globally, bad news, we're still very much in the midst of this crisis. And I know it's very exciting that all 50 states are partially reopened. I know that it's exciting that Disney in Shanghai is open and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, from a public health perspective, we're still in the middle of this. And we are in the middle of the second quarter. And I want to talk a lot about this second quarter, as this will turn out to be the worst quarter of our economic lives. A lot of chit chat about, well, warmer temperatures could maybe kill this virus. But when you look at nations near the equator, for instance, some of the economies or communities in Latin America, Western Africa, so on and so forth, this is global. Wherever people live, this has impacted people. If you look at the situation in America, it's something similar. The coastal areas have, as you know, been hit harder, but we've had hotspots in southeastern Michigan, the Chicago area, so on and so forth. Some of the leading counties in terms of impact from coronavirus or COVID-19, Cook County, Chicago, for instance, the Bronx, New York, Prince George's County, Maryland, so on and so forth. I mean, it's impacted folks across the country. So what does this mean for the economy, of course? And as I talk about the economy, I do not want people to get the idea that I don't care about this from a public health perspective, but my job is to talk about this from an economic perspective. So let me turn to this now. And I have to say that a lot of the data have yet to catch up to the reality. So, you know, the hope is that we get back to where we had been, because the economy was awfully great before COVID-19 hit. Now we're talking about the fact that, but for COVID-19, 2020 was shaping up to be a miraculously good year for the economy, whether construction or other segments of the economy. So it's a shame that this happened and blew up our momentum. Yes, there were some pre-existing vulnerabilities, and I'll talk about those as well. But boy, we came into this period with lots of momentum, which is one of the reasons, parenthetically, that some economists thought that we could get through this public health crisis without a recession. Seems like a crazy notion, but if you look at quotes from various economists, not me, by the way, but quotes from various economists in late February and early March, there are some folks that thought that the sheer momentum of this economy could carry us through. And that momentum included 113 consecutive months of job growth. This is monthly job growth in America. So whether it was Houston that was flooded, or we're in the midst of presidential elections, for 113 consecutive months, we added jobs in America. And over that 113 consecutive month period, we added 22 million jobs in America. Now that ended with March. And so what I've had to do here is I've had to index the data, which goes back to April of 2002, on 2 separate axes. On the left-hand side, April of 2002 through February 2020. On the right-hand side, just March and April of 2020. And why did I do that? Because in April, we lose 20.5 million jobs. And if I put that on one axis, all these other lines just basically disappear. I mean, you see March there. March is the penultimate bar there, that other red bar here. We lost 870,000 jobs in March. But it looks like nothing, because it's axis, it's on that particular axis. So that's why I put it on 2 separate axes. And Kevin mentioned this absolutely correctly. We had a report come out this morning, 8:30 Eastern Standard Time, indicating that over the past week, for which we have data, another 2.4 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance. That brings the 9-week total now to around 39 million Americans who filed for unemployment insurance. 39 million. So, and I'll show you data on that in a moment, but that wonderful run that we had, of course, is now ended. And again, this notion was that, among some economists, that this was an irresistible force, this economic momentum that we enjoyed, but that hit an immovable object known as COVID-19. and the economy dead in its tracks. So if you look at just job totals from April of 2019 to April of 2020, we have lost 19.4 million jobs on a year-ago basis. Look at the sectors that are most impacted. Number one, leisure and hospitality. And in fact, those folks were starting to get impacted as late as February, because, I mean, I should say as early as February, because you might remember that as of February, you'll remember that we were fist pumping at that time. We were elbow bumping. We did the kid and play toe tap. And so there was already some social distancing taking place, and that's not good for leisure and hospitality. Most of those jobs are in hotels and restaurants. Retail trade shows up in the second category. So all those store closures that have taken place really hit the retail workers hard. And construction on a year-over-year basis is down 838,000 jobs. In April 2020 itself, just for that particular month, it lost around 975,000 jobs, not quite a million jobs in 1 month. And you might say, well, look, we had this problem coming into the crisis. We had this problem, we couldn't find construction workers. We couldn't find electricians and carpenters and iron workers and so on and so forth. And this will solve that. At least we'll have plentiful workers, lots of workers. But I'll tell you something, the experience of the Great Recession was that a lot of people who lost their jobs in construction, and during the period of downturn in construction, we lost 2.3 million jobs in construction. A lot of those people never came back to the industry. And there's some data that suggests that about 60% of those folks who lost jobs during that downturn found jobs, but in other industries. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this more in Q&A, but you know, the data are quite awful. So unemployment. You probably heard that the official rate of unemployment in April rose to 14.7%, but don't you believe it, because there was a glitch in the underlying survey, and it was difficult for certain people to answer a certain question. And most economists who have looked at this agree, myself included, that but for that glitch, the unemployment rate was probably about 5 percentage points higher than reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for April, meaning it was closer to 20%. Now, one of the interesting things that has happened, at least interesting to me, is that the effect on the genders has been distinct between the two most recent downturns. So I'm showing you three rates of unemployment here: men in blue, women in green, overall in red. And during the recession of 08-09, it was men who were disproportionately hit hard. And that's because sectors like construction and manufacturing each took it on the chin. Manufacturing also lost about 2 million jobs during that downturn. And men tend to be more present in industries like construction and manufacturing. Women in industries like education and health services. This time is different. As I say, the overall unemployment rate is 14.7% in America officially, but the unemployment rate among women is over 16%. Why is that? Well, because women are more likely to be associated with industries like retail trade, work in hotels. They are more likely to be involved in the travel industry. They are also more likely to be on the front lines of healthcare delivery. An easy majority of American nurses are women, and so many of them have been exposed. Think about the typical nursing home workforce, for instance, that tends to be female-oriented, and so a lot of them have fallen victim to COVID-19, and obviously, hopefully recovered from that. But nonetheless, this time around is different. Women being hit a little bit harder, at least during the early stages of this downturn. Again, you know, some of the data have not fully caught up to the reality. So the latest unemployment rates we have for the regions is for March. And I would argue to you that this crisis began on March 9th. You say, Anirban, you are dead wrong, sir. Dead wrong. Not sure why Kevin invited you, because you are dead wrong. Because they call this COVID-19 for a reason, because it was discovered in 2019. Fair enough, fair point. You scored one on me. But here's what I mean by saying March 9th. Until that time, financial markets didn't even notice that there was this public health crisis. I mean, the financial markets were trading just fine into early March. But on March 9th, the Dow Jones falls more than 2,000 points. And at that time, that was a record point loss on a daily basis for the Dow Jones. We also set new records on March 12th and March 16th. It wasn't until March 11th, just a bit more than 2 months ago, that the Utah Jazz are ushered away from the basketball court, as it is determined that Rudy Gobert, their all-star center, had COVID-19. A few days later, his fellow all-star, Donovan Mitchell, Utah Jazz, a very good team, also was diagnosed. And around that time, of course, the NBA season is shut down. But that's 2 months ago. So early March was decent. And a lot of the survey data that characterized the economy in March were collected early in the month. So it didn't capture the full extent of the damage done to the economy. And so when I show you regional economic data, I'm showing you an unemployment rate in Boston of 3%, Minneapolis 3.4%, my town, Baltimore 3.5%. That's what we want to get back to, those low rates of unemployment. Now, true enough, there were some impacts already on unemployment in March, as it turns out. You see Los Angeles, Seattle, with those high rates of unemployment. Those rates were way up for those communities relative to February. As you know, Seattle was probably the first epicenter in America. And so by that point, the economy had been hit. But it won't be until April, when we get the April data, I should say, that these numbers are going to change, obviously, and these unemployment rates are going to go up. So enjoy this slide, because this is going to be one of the last times you're going to see positive economic data during this presentation. Well, I mean, here's another example, though, of positivity. Because these data only go through the first quarter. This is growth in wages and salaries based on the U.S. Employment Cost Index. Isn't this lovely? So what do we have so far? We have more people working and more people earning more money on the job, right? And you can see the trend line here for wages and salaries. Might I remind you that Amazon is not a 501c3. It's not a charitable organization. So when they raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour, it wasn't for charitable purposes. It was because they were having a difficult time retaining workers. Because just a sea of choices. I mean, we had more job openings than unemployed people during the best of times. And these were in many ways the best of times. Not perfect, it's never perfect. But I mean, all systems go. And because more people were working and more people are making more money on the job, they were putting stuff in the wagons. This is retail sales. Now, Kevin mentioned flagging retail sales, that's for sure. Look at the last two skinny bars here. Those data are from March of 2020 and April of 2020. In March of 2020, retail sales fall off a cliff. Well, you know that 2/3 of the economy is consumer spending. So this gives you some insight into that 2/3 portion of the economy. I mean, consumers also consume services, but this gives you some sense of what's going on. And then look at April's number. I mean, off the table. And so what have we seen so far already? Bankruptcy filings by J. Crew and Neiman Marcus, and most recently JCPenney. JCPenney, a company that was founded in 1902. JCPenney, which by the year 1973 was, had 2,000 plus stores open in America. JCPenney. Now, going back, now they've been in trouble for quite some time. You're aware of that, but nonetheless, it's a sad thing to see, and it means what? That probably as more stores close, more people probably lose their jobs. I mean, we are very much in the midst of this crisis. But again, I mean, how fabulous was it? We know that the economy can be great because it was great. And what's the dream? The dream is low unemployment and low inflation. Well, that's impossible, isn't it? I mean, I have been taught in school, many of you have been taught, that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. It's called the Phillips curve. And we just had a 50-year low in unemployment. When the unemployment rate hit 3.5%, which is where it was pre-crisis, that was effectively a 50-year low in unemployment. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been in America. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. That just gives you some sense. So you would have expected with a 50-year low in unemployment, not knowing anything else, what, we have to have an inflation problem in America. Not so. This is inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. It's actually the core CPI, all items less food and energy, very prominent measure of inflation. And if you look at the chart here, you'll note that in recent years, inflation, generally speaking, has been running between 1.5% and 2.5%. Well, that's perfect. The Federal Reserve's target on Federal Reserve's target inflation rate is 2%. And the fact that we hadn't had to worry about inflation, even during very good economic times, meant that the Federal Reserve could actually cut interest rates not once, not twice, but 3 times last year, the so-called mid-cycle adjustment. Now, it turned out to be a late-cycle adjustment. And you can see also from the last data point here, which is for April of 2020, you see the end of this line, that we have some disinflationary or deflationary pressures, right? Inflation is sinking as global demand for goods and services has collapsed. So I know a lot of you are worried about inflation, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about that during Q&A. But right now, the issue is a loss of pricing power. There's some exceptions. Their food prices have been rising, for instance. We've seen a rebound in oil prices. But we've still got a lot of deflationary pressures out there. We'll talk more about this. But here's the thing. When you have low inflation, you also have low interest rates. And if you've got a lot of job growth and you've got low interest rates, well, that's perfect for construction, isn't it? Because when the economy grows, there's more demand for space, whether in the form of data centers or hotels or office buildings. And if interest rates are low, and here I'm showing you the yield on the 10-year Treasury, happens to be the most liquid bond in the world, so it gets all the attention. But so the cost of capital is low. So you've got what? You've got lots of demand for new space. You've got low cost of capital. What are you going to get? You're going to get a lot of development. And who's that good for? Well, among other people, iron workers or construction in general. Fantastic. That's where we were. Now, look, you can have too much of a good thing. And we economists make the mistake sometimes of speaking about low interest rates as purely benevolent. They're not. Because if you're a retiree, a near retiree, you run a life insurance company or a pension fund, low interest rates are problematic because it makes it difficult to generate income without taking on significant risk in the portfolio. And moreover, the fact that interest rates are so low, including this, the yield on the 10-year Treasury, is an indication of what? It's an indication of fear. So, why are people willing to sit in 10-year Treasury, which is, as I'm speaking to you right now, yielding around 0.66%, actually 0.67% at this point. That's to the second update, 0.67%. But why are people willing to hold an asset like this generating less than 1% interest per year? Because they're scared and they're trying to preserve capital. But again, if you're trying to perpetuate a growth cycle, that sort of borrow and spend, borrow and invest growth cycle, low interest rates are, of course, very helpful, including for construction. So if you had spoken to realtors pre-crisis, what might they have told you? They would have said this. Look, I got lots of people interested in buying a house. I got lots of people who want to look at homes. I got nothing to show them. The inventory of unsold homes is low. So, as we came into this crisis, home builder confidence was at a 20-year high. Home builder confidence was at a 20-year high. Why? Because lots of demand, not much supply. That's an opportunity for home builders to meet unmet demands. And of course, this demand-supply dynamic also is associated with rising home values. So this is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. Home values were generally rising. So what do we have so far? More people working, more people making more money on the job, their property values rising, of course, assuming if they have property. That foments construction. This is residential building permits, graph back to April of 1995. Look at the surge in residential building permits late last year and into 2020. See that? Isn't that beautiful? What was going on there? It's just what we talked about. Not much supply out there. The inventory of unsold homes is low. Lots of demand, good job growth, low interest rates, meaning mortgage rates. But then what happened? COVID-19 happened. So before you build, you have to pull a permit, get permission from government. And so, what have we seen recently? Well, dried up, right? Because credit has dried up, capital has dried up, demand has dried up. Now, it might only be temporary, and we'll talk about that, but it's a shame because, there was, I'm going to talk about this, there were some segments of the economy that had been weak over the course of this expansion, and single-family home building was one of them. We saw a lot of apartments, of course, being constructed for much of the cycle. But single-family home building and townhome construction has been soft, but that was about to change. Such is life. So what about non-residential construction? Well, this is non-residential construction put in place, graph back to March of 2006, happens to come from the Census Bureau, this data series. So in general, through March of 2020, we saw, look, weather has an effect on these data, and there's all kinds of seasonal factors, seasonal patterns. So you don't get a smooth increase. But if you look at this carefully, you'll see that the trend from January 2011 onward, not quite 10 years, has been quite positive. We've had a positive drift in terms of non-residential construction spending. And there have been some segments of construction, non-residential construction, that have really taken off. So that's what you see on this slide. So let me be clear about what I'm talking about. Here. So this comes from the U.S. Census Bureau as well. As defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. Each of these bars represents the percentage growth in the level of construction spending for each of these categories for the 5-year period from March of 2015 to March of 2020. So basically what I'm doing is I'm comparing construction spending in March of 2020 versus 5 years earlier. And you can see at the very top, public safety. What's that about? So a lot of the spending, construction spending that we saw in March, for instance, the Javits Center in New York, to get that ready to handle patients and so on and so forth, all those emergency expenditures, you might have thought would have shown up in healthcare, but they didn't. They showed up in public safety. And that's just how categorically they showed up. And so if you look at March of 2019 versus March of 2020, just the last year, public safety related construction spending is up 45%. So almost all the increase over the past 5 years has been in the last 1 year. And that's probably temporary as structures were being expanded, built, modified, as we were trying to deal with the public health crisis. After that comes lodging and office. What is lodging? That includes hotel room construction and office. We built a lot of office buildings. Class A and Class A plus office buildings. And by the way, office category also includes data centers. So I'm going to talk about that more as we go through this presentation, but just keep that in mind. The fact that we build a lot of hotels and office buildings, that commercial category includes your distribution centers or fulfillment centers, as well as your retail space. So we built a fair amount of that as well. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And then finally, to just round out this part of the presentation, speaking to pre-existing economic momentum, where we want to get back to, the stock market itself. So more people working, more people earning more money on the job, their home values rising, and then their portfolios rising. You remember that joke that we all used to tell? I know Kevin used to tell this joke back in 08, 09. Remember that joke? Oh, my 401k is now a 201k. You remember that joke? No one actually ever laughed at that joke. But then the 201k became an 801k. And that was fun. As I said, I'm indexing the Dow Jones to the right, the NASDAQ and the S&P to the left. And so we had lots of money, lots of wealth creation in this society. And it appeared that the economy was this irresistible force. But even as the economy was expanding, we had the emergence of some vulnerabilities, some susceptibilities. Not everything was right. If you peered under the hood, the car looked like it was running great, but if you peered under the hood, there were some issues there. There are some vulnerabilities there. Let's talk about that now. And I've said to impact audiences and other audiences before that, I felt that a recession was coming within the next 12 to 18 months. Even before COVID-19, because of these vulnerabilities. Number one, not all segments of the economy were performing well. I can point to a few. So single-family home building is one example, but of course that was set to take off as we enter 2020. But a better example, therefore, is agriculture. Farmers have been dealing with the impact of trade wars, low soybean prices, low corn prices, so on and so forth. A lot of farmers have had to take on a lot of debt, including from non-traditional lending sources. Another sector that's been weak is manufacturing. This is the Institute of Supply Management's Purchasing Managers Index. Any reading below 50 means that manufacturing as an industry is in recession. It was in recession in 2001. Well, of course it was. The broader economy was in recession in 2001. It was in recession in 2008, 2009. Not surprising, the broader economy was in recession in 08, 09. And it was in recession 5 months late last year. So any reading below 50 on this slide, as I say, means that manufacturing is in recession. You see the 50-yard line running west-east across the slide. What was going on? Trade war with China, strong US dollar, which among other things frustrates US export growth. The fact that the US auto sector likely peaked in terms of its activity in 2016. Lately, it's been having to compete with a lot of cars coming off of lease, relatively new cars with little mileage and so on and so forth, good condition. And then also the issues at Boeing and the 737 MAX. So we entered this period with some vulnerability. Now, late last year, what happens? We get that first phase trade with China. We get ratification of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We get Boris Johnson's resounding victory in the United Kingdom. So we get some certitude regarding Brexit. When was the last time you talked about Brexit? You used to talk about Brexit all the time. You don't talk about Brexit anymore, do you? You might talk about Boris Johnson, but not Brexit. So all of a sudden, all that uncertainty that was wafting over the global supply chain, over global manufacturing began to abate. And so by early 2020, manufacturing is actually out of recession. The reading goes up to 50.9, but then because COVID-19 affected China first, and China is a quarter of global manufacturing, you start to see supply chain disruptions. And then by March and April, we saw global demand Also, US demand for goods starting to wane. And so all of a sudden, manufacturing is in a very deep recession. The reading now 41.5. And you can see the trajectory here. It's not positive. But then, I would say the greatest source of vulnerability was the accumulated debt. And one could make the argument that America's been growing for all the wrong reasons, or at least many of the wrong reasons. Let's do some math here, shall we? So last year, America's economy grew 2.3% in real terms, meaning inflation-adjusted terms, 2.3%. Okay. I didn't show it to you, but there's another measure of inflation that the Federal Reserve prefers to the core CPI. It's called the core PCE deflator. PCE stands for personal consumption expenditures. And that measure of inflation suggests that inflation last year ran at around 1.6 or 1.7%. No. So now, if you add those two numbers together, 2.3 and 1.7, what you get 4%. So in nominal terms, America's economy grew 4%. Let's do some more math, shall we? Because it's fun. Last year, 2019 calendar year, America runs a $1.02 trillion federal budget deficit. We, the American people, produced $21.7 trillion in economic output last year. So if you do the math on that, the federal budget deficit as a fraction of GDP was 4.6%. You take away that 4.6% federal deficit spending, there is no economic growth in America, at least not statistically. Now, what I'm showing you here is information from the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. The darker blue-colored bars here represent forecasts of the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP pre-COVID-19. So coming into the crisis, we had already amassed a $23.5 trillion national debt. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that for the current federal fiscal year 2020, our indebtedness, our budget debt, our budget deficit will be $3.7 trillion, and it will be $2.1 trillion next year, and that's if there's no additional stimulus, which there probably will be. We'll talk about that. And of course, it's not just the federal government that's been ramping up debt, so too has the American household. Yes, there was a period of deleveraging of the American household post-Great Recession. People were paying down debt, or at least having that debt written off by their banks. But that ended several years ago. Here I'm showing you various flavors of debt, household debt, mortgage in orange, blue is credit card, red is student loans, green is auto loans. In nominal terms, consumers have never been this indebted, which is part of the stress, of course. Part of the stress is not only is the rent due, but so is the credit card bill and the student loan and the auto loan and the mortgage and so on and so on. Well, not if you have rent, I suppose. But the point is, my goodness, this was a source of vulnerability coming into this crisis. And so consumers have had to really pull back hard on their consumption, especially if they've lost a job, to pay back the debt. And then corporate debt has never been greater. You say, Anirban, how is this possible? You just talked about a booming stock market. Undoubtedly, company finances have been good. Undoubtedly, corporate earnings have been strong. And by the way, didn't we cut corporate taxes in late 2017? Haven't corporations had a lot of cash thanks to that in part? Yeah, that's right. But this is what happens when you buy back your shares every year as a publicly traded company. You issue debt to buy back the shares, debt goes up, equity goes down. Now, it's good for the shareholders because return on equity goes up, right? You still got the same corporate earnings, but fewer shares outstanding, so earnings per share goes up. So share price goes up. But you're also left with more indebted balance sheets. This is also what happens when you buy your competitors. Often mergers and acquisitions are financed through debt. So the peak year for stock repurchases in the cycle was 2018, the year after we passed that tax cut. And then the peak year for mergers and acquisitions was 2017, as it turns out. But every year has been big for stock repurchases and mergers and acquisitions activity. You might remember last week, the big talk, or one of the big news stories was the potential for Uber to buy Grubhub, for instance. But, we hear about potential mergers constantly. So this was part of the vulnerability, but there's more. How about productivity? Or productivity growth or the lack thereof. So productivity is measured as output per hour worked. Output per hour worked. Okay. So now ultimately, it is productivity that determines how rapidly our living standards will rise. So this is, if you think about economic growth is simply productivity growth plus labor force growth. That's all it is. Now you can, in the short term at least, bulk up your standard of living by taking a lot of debt. So if you borrow from the future to consume today, you can make yourself feel wealthier. You can consume more today. But ultimately, as a nation, our output and therefore our prosperity depends upon productivity growth and labor force growth. And at the individual level, it depends highly on productivity growth. When I was growing up, I grew up in Kankakee County, Illinois, on the Indiana border. When I was growing up, they said to me, Aniban, because that's my name, Aniban, we will grow on average 3% a year in America in real terms, 3% a year. I mean, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. I mean, sometimes Jimmy Carter's president, sometimes Ronald Reagan, sometimes Bill Clinton, but 3% a year on average. What would I say now as an economist to you if you asked me that question? How fast will we grow on average per year, Aniban? I mean, setting aside COVID-19, I would say 2%, maybe a little less than that. Why? Because U.S. productivity, look at the third bullet here, U.S. productivity has risen at an average rate of 1.3% since 2007, compared with a 2.1% average since the end of World War II. That's a delta of almost 1 percentage point a year. And of course, the labor force is not growing as rapidly as it used to. Baby boomers are retiring in large numbers. Baby boomers are retiring in large numbers. And moreover, immigration policy has changed. And by the way, though we're focused right now on COVID-19, there's still other issues out there, aren't there? Weren't there things going on in the world before COVID-19? Didn't we have a skirmish with the Iranians early in 2020? January 8th, the Iranians retaliate. There's still a North Korea. There's still a rest of the Middle East. There's still a France. Now, interesting, this is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Interestingly, global uncertainty was actually declining late in 2019. Why? Because America and China signed the first phase trade agreement, so trade tensions were abating. Because Boris Johnson had that resounding victory in the United Kingdom. I'm not saying I'm a Boris Johnson fan, but at least that victory gave us some more certitude, some greater certitude regarding Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union. And then, of course, we got ratification late last year of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. So the global supply chain was ready to come back to life. Uncertainty was abating. But then now with COVID-19, the global economy in recession, each nation going its own direction, with trade tensions rebuilding, particularly between the US and China, global policy uncertainty is rising again. And that, of course, exacerbates the underlying crisis. And then finally, in terms of the vulnerabilities, high asset prices coming into this period. So commercial real estate values were quite high, stock prices were quite high. This is the Shiller price earnings ratio. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to juxtapose the value of shares on the S&P 500 vis-a-vis the underlying corporate earnings. And there's been some compression in price earnings recently, but if you go back to the pre-crisis moment, let's say March 9th, you would have to go back to March of 2000, just before the dot-com bust, to find a stock market so brilliantly priced to perfection. So what goes up can come down, what goes up a lot can come down a lot. That's what I'm trying to say. It was a vulnerability. And so we had a Dow Jones that went from over 29,000 to around 18,000 in the blink of an eye. That's vulnerability. And I'm so pleased that the Dow Jones, as I'm speaking to you, is trading at 24,476.90. That's your up to the second update. But and so it's come back a lot. And we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. Some of that's obvious. But look, it was a source of vulnerability. Now, do not get me wrong. We Americans came off a phenomenal decade. I mean, for decades, America's share of global output has been in decline. And our share of global output has been in decline often because it's been engineered to decline. By whom? By the Americans themselves. It was the Americans who fashioned the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe post-World War II. It was the Americans who spent their own treasure to help accelerate the recovery of the Japanese economy post-World War II in an effort to try to turn our sworn enemies into our future trading partners, and boy, did it work. Germany today is the fourth largest economy in the world. Japan is third. But something special happened during the previous decade. America's share of global output actually rose from 23% at the beginning of the decade to 25% by decade's end. Look, we Americans have problems, right? Our national debt, our infrastructure, our broken politics, both locally and nationally. But we must be doing something right because we're home to less than 5% of the world's population. We're responsible for a quarter of its output. And I'd like to say something that maybe may not be appropriate to say during an impact webinar. It might come off as cheesy or excessively patriotic, but I really believe, based on these data and other data, we Americans may be the least messed up people in the world. I know that's strong, that's bold. But you can understand why I say such a thing. But that said, does this performance, as remarkable as it is, justify this performance? This is stock market returns by country or region, 2010 to 2019, that same period. Look at American stock market return here, 256%. Now, a decade has 10 years. So if you divide 256% by 10, what do you get? You get a massive annual rate of return. The back of the envelope calculation there. Look at India, for instance, a country that in a bad economic year, I mean pre-COVID-19, would grow 6% in real terms, 46%. But you wouldn't know that from its stock market performance. So whether you look in absolute terms at the price earnings ratios, or you look at relative terms like I'm showing you here, we had a market that was pretty pricey. And in some sense, I'm concerned that the market has come back as rapidly as it has, because it feels as if there's much worse news out there than is reflected in stock prices. But set that aside. Now, again, there was some naivete among certain economists who thought we could get through this without a recession. Nonsense. Because there are certain aspects of this crisis that render it different from previous crises. And so I've done the 9, I've done the 7. Here are 3 things that render COVID-19 different economically. Number 1, it's a supply shock. So 2008, 2009 was a demand shock. The money disappeared, right? The credit dried up. People were defaulting on their loans, there were delinquents, so on and so forth. If homes were being foreclosed, credit tightened up, the money disappeared. So what did we do in response? We had the Troubled Access Relief Program. We recapitalized the banks with that. We had quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve. We pumped trillions of dollars of liquidity into the financial system to try to juice the economy up, to put the air back in the balloon, and it worked, if you think about it, because that fomented the lengthiest economic expansion in American history. But this is a supply shock. You can print as much money as you want. If people can't go to work, where can output go? Nowhere. This is quarantines, travel bans, closure of public places. No Major League Baseball season, no NBA playoffs, no March Madness. That also produces supply chain disruptions and factory closures. And in some cases, construction projects have been interrupted because it was not deemed to be an essential industry in parts or all of New York, New Jersey, California, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. That helps explain why in April we lost 975,000 construction jobs in America. Now, it's true that as people lose jobs, that supply shock is met with a follow-on demand shock because people have less income, less certainty, less confidence, so on and so forth. So that, I don't want to use the D word, depression, but it's a depression, right? Because a depression is defined as what? A 10% or more decline in economic activity. Well, by this quarter, the economy will have shrunk 10% from where it had been pre-crisis. Now, it'll be a very short depression. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there is no way that this economy, no matter how much momentum it had, could continue to expand when you shut it down. And of course, the global economy was already fragile coming into this period. I won't read all of this, but I want to pick off that second bullet. Already trade wars, this is according to the International Monetary Fund, according to the IMF, already trade wars have pushed global growth in 2019 to its lowest rate since the 0.7% contraction in 2009. Now, there was some momentum building into 2020. So while the global economy grew 2.9% last year, according to the International Monetary Fund, it was set to grow 3.3% this year. But the forecast from the International Monetary Fund now is negative 3% growth for the global economy. And it's going to actually be worse than that. We economists are coming to terms with how bad this is. See, our models, our statistical models can't capture how bad things are in some sense. Because what a model does, it takes what happened in the past and sort of figures out, based on the latest data points, what's going to happen based on that history in the future. See, in some sense, when you do a forecast, you can't get away from the historical relationship between variables. But there is no COVID-19 variable we can introduce into our model. So we have tended to underestimate the extent of this. So, but as more data come in, the models are getting more refined. This quarter will be the worst quarter of our economic lives, the second quarter. The Conference Board, for instance, predicts a 44.5% decline in GDP on an annualized basis this quarter. By comparison to the worst quarter of the Great Recession in late 2008, the economy shrank 8.4%. That was a baby downturn compared to this thing. This is a monster. Goldman Sachs economist, 39% prediction. JP Morgan, negative 40% GDP second quarter, so on and so forth. Again, on an annualized basis. Oxford Economics, we'll talk about them. They do a very good job forecasting the economy globally and nationally. Predicts that the global economy will shrink 5% this year. I mean, catastrophic. Obviously, some people are more vulnerable than others. And one of the things that this has done, in addition to hitting women harder than the previous downturn, for instance, at least women harder than men, one of the other things that it has done is it has widened income disparity, because people who live in households earning less than $40,000 per year have been much more vulnerable to job loss than people who live in households where the income is over $100,000. And you can understand when you look at these data why that is the case. This comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Now, their study, conducted a couple of months ago, looked at 144.7 million jobs in America, okay? And of that group, if you look at the first bolded row there, employed in occupations at low risk of layoff, about 54%. But that means 46%, if you look at the row below that that's in bold, employed in occupations at high risk of layoff, 46% of folks are at high risk of layoff during this period, 46%. Now, if you go down, like food preparation and serving related occupations, that's your restaurant workers. Sales and related occupations, that's your retail workers. And then comes what? Production occupations. Why are these vulnerable? Because you have to be there to deliver the service. You have to be physically present. And when you've got social distancing directives, those are the industries that are going to be hit hardest. Some of us in the service sector, we can work remotely. I can sit in front of this computer all day. I can work. I'm an economist. What do I produce? Nothing, jack. But you and the people who work for you, you produce a lot. You actually create wealth for the society, because that's one of the things that construction does, along with manufacturing and agriculture. So if I say to you that unemployment could rise to 25 to 30% during the current quarter, that's not a fantasy. We've known that for a couple of months. So, you know, Kevin mentioned in his introduction the fact that another 2.4 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance. It happened to be for the week ended May 16th. Good news here, with each and every passing week, fewer people file for unemployment claims. That's good. On the other hand, if you look at the blue part of this line, before the crisis, about 200,000 people were filing for unemployment insurance in any given week. So 2.4 million is an order of magnitude greater than that. Now, these data can also be misleading, because it is conceivable that someone could lose a job today, file for unemployment insurance, and then get a job tomorrow. That's conceivable. I'm not saying it happens, certainly not often, but I'm saying it's conceivable. So what might matter more is continuing claims, people who are currently on unemployment insurance. Now, we received these data also at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, but unfortunately, these data are a week lagged, only through the week ending May 9th. And here I have some awful news to bring, because you see the kink in the line there, that red part, there's a little kink there, it flattens out. That was a false positive. So what we saw that week was that the number of people on unemployment insurance didn't grow that quickly, which meant that even though a lot of people were filing for unemployment insurance, a lot of other people were getting jobs. At least that's what the data were suggesting. But it might have just been a statistical aberration, because this week we just saw the number of people on continuing claims just skyrocket to past 25 million. So, and again, that's for May 9th. That's for the weekend of May 9th. Well, you know, we're May 21st now. That's almost 2 weeks ago. So yeah, we're in the midst of it. Now, with that set up in place, let's talk about the recovery to come. And one of the, because we will recover, because one of the great questions has been this, and people ask the following question, you know, is the recovery going to be L-shaped, square root, Nike swoosh, check mark, U, V, W, what's it going to be? Well, we'll talk about that, but I think the initial stage of recovery is going to be a V, V for victory. Now, this comes from the aforementioned Oxford Economics. This is a global outlook. Too much stuff going on in this by half, so let me walk you through this. You see the red line there? The red line represents their global economic forecast as of January. Now, January was pre our understanding of COVID-19, this pandemic and its economic impact. So that was the forecast as of January, right? And what you see is, and this is indexed, that the global economy is expected to have a steady rate of incline. Nice growth, right? We had some reasons for optimism coming into 2020. The blue line is the current forecast. No, we had COVID-19. And so you see that sharp drop off for the early phases of 2020 and into the middle part of the year. And then what do you see thereafter? you see a sharp bounce back. If you look carefully at that blue line, what do you see? The letter V, V for victory. Now, I'm saying it's going to be a V, not because Oxford Economics says so. I'm saying it's a V because that's what it has been when we've had prior pandemics on this planet. This comes from Goldman Sachs. Again, too much stuff going on this graphical element, right? I'm whizzing through this stuff, right? Too much. Just fixate on one line for me, okay? The blue line. You see the blue line that goes way up and then back down again? Just fixate on that. That characterizes Hong Kong's economy 2003 during its SARS epidemic. So the skinny black line that goes across at 0%, that's the pre-existing average rate of growth. That's pre-crisis rate of growth, okay? Now, as the crisis begins, whether in Hong Kong or China or wherever, South Korea, Canada, as the crisis begins, what happens? Growth goes below its prevailing average, before its pre-existing average. Okay, that's predictable, of course. And if you look at that blue line, what happens thereafter? Things get worse before they get better. Well, of course, because more segments of the economy are being impacted by the pandemic, the public health crisis. But what do you also notice? Thereafter, a sharp bounce back in economic activity. It's a V, a lot of V's on this chart. Now, if you look at things from the perspective of weeks, so Georgia opens up and South Carolina opens up and Maryland waits and New York waits and so on and so forth, yeah, it's not going to be a V. If you look at it from the perspective of weeks, because from that perspective, the opening up of the economy will be gradual, it's not a V. This is from the perspective of months and quarters. And if you look at things from the perspective of months and quarters, it's going to be a V. Now, it's going to be an awkward V. Why do I say that? So a V is made up of two linear segments, right? Two line segments. The downward part of that line is going to be lengthier than the upward part of the line. Complete recovery will prove elusive for years. It'll take years. If I ask Kevin a quiz question, Kevin, how long did it take us to get to a 50-year low in unemployment? He's clever, so he would know. Anibon, it took 50 years. Exactly. There's no guarantee of complete recovery anytime soon. But the initial phase of recovery will be quite rapid. In other words, we're going to get some great data from the third and fourth quarters of 2020. As we come back, we turned off the economy, we're going to turn it back on. Now, another reason to think it's going to be a V is because we put so much stimulus into the economy, right? 4 phases of stimulus already. The largest being phase 3, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, right? That was that PPP and all these kinds of things in which people have great interest. And we put even more money in phase 4 into the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, right? Okay, so as our Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, has pointed out, a lot of the money that's been authorized under these various stimuli have yet to hit the economy. And by the way, more stimulus probably to come, because the House of Representatives just passed a $3 trillion stimulus bill, phase 5. Now, I understand Mitch McConnell and some folks in the Senate don't like this package very much. It's going to be negotiated. But remember, we have a presidential election year. And so what does that mean? I better show the American people, if I'm the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, that I cared during the crisis. If I show that I did not care enough, that could hurt me in November. Not just presidential race, senatorial races, House of Representatives, local races, so on and so forth. I got to show I care. So it's going to be very hard for them to get to November without another stimulus package, including assistance for state and local governments. And we might also get an infrastructure package at some point in the near future. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that during Q&A. So more stimulus to come, another reason to think it's going to be a V, which takes me to my final slide, the 1 forecast. So I'd have done the 9, the 7, the 3, and here comes the 1. I'll begin with the most obvious thing an economist could say, which is recession's already begun globally in the United States. Of course it has. But, and this is where I disagree with certain economists, I still expect this depression or recession to be short and vicious, which is how my wife characterizes me. And one of the reasons I think it's going to be short, because a lot of folks are concerned about what? Oh, come the fall, it's going to come back on us in the fall. I'm not saying it won't. I'm not an epidemiologist. But here's what I know. I know that there are over 100 clinical and preclinical trials out there looking for a vaccine or therapies. I know that there are a lot of smart people who work for Regeneron, Pfizer, Merck, Gilead Sciences, Bayer AG, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, Novartis, so on and so forth. The life sciences community. And they're working. We already know that a Gilead Sciences drug, remdesivir, has some clinical efficacy. Short and vicious. The best positioned people work in the public sector, greater job stability, But it's been frustrating to watch folks in Detroit and Los Angeles who work in the public sector lose their jobs, because that exacerbates the crisis, because we know the private sector workforce is being hammered. Officially, unemployment has reached 14.0%, but as I say, don't you believe it, there's probably close to 20% by April's end, and probably over 20% now. Good guess, 22 or 23% as I'm speaking to you today. And because our models can't really catch up with the reality of this, our collective expectations as economists are still adjusting to the downside, but we're getting closer now to what this is going to look like. And I'll tell you something, my final point, when it commences, recovery from this crisis will be sharp, profound, and of course, most welcome. Look, when people go back to work, what are they going to find? Interest rates are low. There's pent-up demand for all kinds of goods. There's a need to rebuild inventories, including at auto dealerships. And people are anxious to meet again, go to restaurants, go to a movie that they're not watching in their home and not on Netflix, but actually a movie, like the next new James Bond film. Or watch the Orioles, which is the greatest thing that a human being can do, short of nurturing a child, and engage in other most wonderful of human activities. So watch for it. Third and fourth quarters of the year are going to be quite brilliant. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch us come back to life economically, though, of course, as I say, complete recovery will prove elusive for years. And with that, I give it back to you, Kevin.
Wow, Anubhav. Is the downward slope of the V as bad an implosion as the Ravens back in January in the playoffs?
No, nothing is that bad. Look, we had the best record in the NFL during the regular season and the worst record in the playoffs. So basically, the Ravens' loss, if that were to happen economically, would be all of us get COVID-19 and every business shuts down.
I'm from Detroit. We don't have pro football. We do have a few questions here. How is our massive national debt? Hold on, when they come in. How's our massive national debt going to interface with inflation? Will our debt have an effect on inflation?
Right. So the answer is yes, but not now. Right now, because the global economy is in such disarray, it's actually deflation or disinflation. We're seeing inflation fall. Now, there's some exceptions. Food prices have been rising as an example. There's some issues with meat, for instance. And oil prices actually have bounced back recently, but that has a lot to do with Saudi Arabians cutting back production, so on and so forth. But generally speaking, we're not going to see much inflation anytime soon. There's not that much pricing power in the economy. But we haven't had inflation really being a problem in our society for actually decades now, and it would not surprise me that within 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden the biggest story in town economically was about inflation. Because not only is the federal government spending a lot of money, but probably even more importantly, the Federal Reserve is creating a lot of money supply. And economics says that when you increase money supply, one of two things can happen. Either output goes up or prices go up. And we're output constrained because we don't have a very large and growing workforce. Productivity growth is not what it once was. So if output can't really rise when you pump up the economy with more money supply, then what has to take over is probably price increases. So I think inflation is part of our future, 2 or 3 years from now. It's going to take some time to get there because the world economy has to get itself back together again. But ultimately, yeah, I think inflation could be a problem.
Are we talking 1970s double-digit inflation or something more moderate?
No, it's something more moderate. So the 1970s inflationary episodes were driven by a surge in oil prices. And oddly enough, as oil prices were starting to really affect inflation in the economy, the Federal Reserve responded by saying, well, let's put even more money into the economy to help people pay for that higher gasoline price. And so what that did was that triggered even more inflation. That's when Paul Volcker stepped in, our tallest Federal Reserve secretary ever, 6'7" tall, Paul Volcker, and he cuts money supply growth in the early 80s, which drives us into a double-dip recession. And many folks here, or some folks here at least, will remember the 81-82 recession was devastating, including for construction. And he wrung the inflation out of this economy, setting the stage for the great booms of the 1980s and the 1990s. But now again, what do we have? We have all this money supply creation, unlike we've ever seen before. And it should be remembered that we printed a lot of money or created a lot of money supply after the Great Recession. We didn't have an inflation problem, but this time could be different because the federal government is spending like crazy at this point.
Let me ask you this. The auto industry in the U.S., Detroit-based companies, they go back to work by and large Tuesday. What does that do to the overall economy and the unemployment rate?
Very positive. So the auto workers tend to make enough such that they're not tempted to stay out of the workforce by collecting $600 in weekly federal government checks, right? That if they don't show up to work, they're much more worried about losing that job permanently. So they'll turn away in many cases that unemployment insurance check. I'm sure you can find exceptions, but generally they're going to show up to work when Ford or General Motors or Chrysler calls them back. That's very positive. So like I say, we're going to start to see some signs of progress during the second quarter. It'll still try to be the worst quarter of our economic lives, but we're turning the economy back on, right? We're seeing people go to bars in Columbus, Ohio, at great risk to their own health, as it turns out, but they're hanging out and having a good time, just spending money on alcohol. Okay, so they show up in the economic data as a positive for now. So, and then the third quarter, even more opens up. And I think one of the things that will cause us to open up faster is the NFL season's coming, and Americans need their football. And, you can take away March Madness and so on and so forth, and we can sit around watching the 2015 NCAA tournament as a replacement. But we want our football. So, again, I think that over the next couple of months, you're going to start to see this V-shaped take off. And it starts, I think, with people going back to work, including the manufacturing sector.
Let's go to some more questions here, Anirban. Doesn't higher unemployment, parenthetically, overall or within a market segment, end of parentheses, equate to a reduced strain on labor force demands? Wouldn't that also equate to a release of capital for construction projects? Or is that oversimplification, non-economist layman's point of view?
Well, I mean, lower unemployment reduces aggregate demand for goods and services. And if you have overall lower demand for goods and services, you actually have less demand for productive space, whether office space or hotels or factories or whatever it happens to be, all things be equal. Now, because of the nature of the crisis, you're probably going to have more demand for investment or reinvestment in hospitals because they've been beaten up by the crisis. They need more ICU beds and ventilators and all that. You're going to see more investment in data centers because the e-commerce economy got a big shove forward, and that's a very data-intensive part of the economy. And also there's more demand to find repositories for public health information. But overall, I think it's very much a negative for construction, isn't it? And the fact that so many companies have realized that their workers can work remotely has to have some impact. Doesn't mean the end of office space, doesn't mean the end of new office buildings, but it's going to take some time for commercial real estate in particular to come back. Think about movie theaters, right? People have their Netflix accounts now and their Disney Plus and their Hulu and so on and so forth. Hulu is wildly expensive if you get a certain package, but people are spending on it. People have Peloton bikes now. So who's going to go to the gym? Well, lots of people go to the gym, but fewer people. None of that's good for construction.
You mentioned commercial construction. Our employers and the ironworkers do a tremendous amount of commercial construction. How do you see, a lot of people are working remotely that never did before. And there's a trade-off between paying a lot of money per square foot or having your employee work from home. How do you see that playing out in terms of commercial construction? And when I say commercial, I'm talking office-based construction.
Right. So this is a tough one, I have to say, Kevin, because I'm speculating now. This is a sociological question as much as an economic one. But let's boil it down to economic fundamentals. What are enterprises trying to accomplish? They're trying to profit maximize. So when people talk about, I can have my workers work remotely, I don't have to lease office space, I'm saving money. And it is true, to be a profit maximizer, you have to be a cost minimizer, and that would serve to minimize costs. Okay, but that's not the end of the story, Kevin, because the other thing that you have to do is you have to have a productive workforce. Mm-hmm. And can your workers stay productive when they're working from home and they have so many distractions and they have kids running around and so on and so forth, and they don't want to get out of their pajamas? I don't think so. And by the way, managers like to manage, supervisors like to supervise. Yeah. And so when you have people working from home, I believe you lose productivity. Now, in the first month of the crisis, when so many people are losing their jobs, it might not show up because people are anxious to impress their boss. I can still do this, boss. But after month 2, month 3, month 4 of working remotely, you're going to lose, my guess is, a lot of productivity. And when you factor that in, I think a lot of employers will still embrace the office space concept. But we're going to end this period with lots of empty office suites, very high vacancy rates, a lot of unpaid rent. And so that's going to frustrate office construction, new office construction for some time to come. Final point on this. You will, however, see a renaissance of Class B buildings. Because before, A lot of people were moving from Class B space to Class A space, paying more rent in the process for recruitment purposes. If you're a law firm, an accounting firm, an architectural firm, and you're trying to recruit the best and the brightest young talents, right? You need to bring them into your offices, and they need to be impressed that this is a success address. I want to work here. So you move from Class B to Class A during a time of very low unemployment. But look at the class of 2020. How many jobs are out there for them? I don't need Class A space anymore to recruit. So I'm going to go for Class B. I'm going to take less square footage, but I've got to upgrade or have the HVAC system upgraded, because viruses can spread through air handling systems. So you're going to see a lot of investment, rehabilitation, modernization into the Class B infrastructure of America. So fewer new Class A buildings built, but much more money being spent to position Class B buildings.
What about greater geographic space? I saw a blurb, I didn't read the article. GSA needed 126,000 square feet of space because you got to space people out more.
Yes, that's possible. But I mean, doesn't that all go away if we have a vaccine?
I would
And
think.
Pfizer is talking about having a vaccine potentially by the fall, an emergency vaccine. Now, again, it's going to take time to manufacture it in sufficient quantities with sufficient dosage and all that. I get that. It's not going to be instantaneous. But all of this desire to social distance, the CDC guidelines came out saying that on school buses, you have to you have kids sit down, the middle seat is empty, and you have to skip a row. Well, I mean, you're not going to be able to get all the kids to school.
Yeah.
So this is not a practical solution from the longer term perspective. This is a short term response, knee-jerk response to the emergency. My thinking is we're going to get a therapy. We already have therapies that work on monkeys. And so, how much further down the road can it be for humans? I don't think too far.
Okay, it's the vast majority of our contractors are small contractors. So as small contractors, should we focus on being diverse in the industry? Mr. Basu, as an economist, could you suggest areas of potential growth for our companies in the future?
Right, so small contractors, as I say, there's going to be a lot of hospital remodeling, a lot of focus on existing facilities. And that's, by the way, isn't that the case every time we have an economic downturn like this, that contractors focus their attention from new construction, which is what they focused on during the upturn, when a lot of projects were being bid out, right, to modification of existing structures, of course. But I mean, don't get me wrong, it's going to be a tougher market.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is that some contractors, my guess is, not your members, are going to disappear from the marketplace. This is also an opportunity for you or companies to recruit better quality workers, because there's more workers out there to be recruited. But what can I tell you? This is the greatest downturn of our lives. It's the worst quarter of our lives. That has an economic impact. So I'd like to sugarcoat it.
Right.
But how can I sugarcoat it? I just can't.
Let me ask you this. This is a question from our audience. And let me use an analogy. I'm kind of speaking on behalf of this person. After September 11th, people asked about what if this happens again? And you and other economists said, well, we're used to it. We can rebound faster. We'll be prepared. Same deal with the second wave of COVID that's coming, allegedly?
I think so. I think here's my proposition. And I could be dead wrong about this. And if I am, I apologize for it. But my feeling is that our medical toolkit come October, November, December is just going to be much more potent than the medical toolkit we had in February, March, April, where we were basically powerless. The only thing we could do was social distance, right? Because our hospitals were set to be overwhelmed. Some already were. I mean, look what's happened to our nursing homes across this country. I mean, it's been devastating. But we're going to have a better medical toolkit. Ultimately, look, we've had this in our country before. Not a lot of people in the audience will remember this, but we had this issue with polio in the early 1950s.
Right.
And we had social distancing then. And thank God we had a young scientist named Jonas Salk, who was 40 years old and developed a vaccine in 1955 that came, just 40 years old. Thank goodness. And that's what we need here. And so how much do we talk about polio anymore? We don't talk about polio anymore. Thank God for Jonas Salk.
Absolutely.
So, we're going to get a cure to this, and therapies, if not a vaccine, but probably both. And then we're going to move on. And by the year 2022, we're going to be talking about something totally different. And people are going to say, remember that COVID-19 thing? My God, that was crazy.
The Detroit Lions will have won the Super Bowl by then. Okay, why has the stock market gained back so much of its loss loss, do you fear another downturn that will last longer?
Well, I do fear, I mean, I always fear this, by the way. I fear this under normal circumstances. The Dow Jones at any given time, can fall. I mean, some people might remember that period in October of 1987 where the Dow Jones just tumbled more than 20% in a single day, and it came out of nowhere. But I really think that the stock market has performed much better than I could have predicted. As I said, we went from 29,000 on the Dow to around 18,000, and then we surged back up to 24,000. Why is that? A few reasons. Number one, they've pumped in a lot of money supply. They've cut interest rates. Some companies have performed well economically. There has been some progress on, vaccine research and therapeutic research, so on and so forth. But I think it's also because of all the stimulus from the federal government. And I think if you look at the stock market's valuation and then you look at the performance of the underlying economy, there is a discontinuity there. It doesn't make sense. So am I nervous? Yeah, I'm nervous. But if you ask me the question, why has the stock market done so well? It's done well because interest rates are low, because we have seen some progress on, clinical trials. It's because the Federal Reserve is, pumped in even more money supply because the federal government's spending like crazy. All these factors the stock market likes until it stops liking them.
Construction is typically last to get hit and last to recover. What are your thoughts on the construction recovery timeline versus the overall economy?
It'll take years and years and years to get us back and commercial real estate in particular, because again, we are entering this new period with a lot of empty vacant office suites, a lot of vacant storefronts, a lot of entrepreneurs who are out of the game and no longer going to be able to consume space or pay rent. And by the way, this time around, pre-existing backlog was not the protection that normally is. We lost 975,000 construction jobs in April, despite plentiful backlog coming into the crisis. Why? Because New York, New Jersey, California, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, all the parts of those states said construction is non-essential. But here's the other thing. We have right now, and I think this really matters for iron workers, we have right now a lot of project owners who are negotiating with general contractors, who bid out projects late last year, early this year, and are saying, look, I bid this project with you when the construction economy was strong, when you couldn't find subcontractors, and subcontractors couldn't find workers. Now the economy is weak. We're going to have a 40% reduction in GDP this quarter, so I'm going to rebid the project. I'm going to postpone the project, and I'm going to wait for you to give me a better bid one of these days.
Yep.
And so what does that mean? In the short term, at least, you're going to see a lot of project postponements, and some project cancellations. And then in the longer term, this ongoing suppression of demand for new construction because credit tightens up after periods like this. So cost of capital goes way up for developers. Two, why would I build new office buildings when I've got so much vacancy in recently constructed office buildings? There are some exceptions. Data centers, hospitals. You're going to see some investment in those categories. You're going to see a lot of investment in HVAC systems and existing structures. But for the most part, it's going to take years to fully recover. That's my prediction. I could be dead wrong. I hope I am.
How will we know when we've hit bottom? Is it always determined by looking in the rearview mirror?
We will know that we've hit bottom. I think you look at those weekly initial unemployment claims, and when we get to normalcy, when we don't see the level of layoffs we have seen, that's when we know we've hit bottom. When we get to back basically towards 250,000 initial unemployment claims in a given week, that's when we know we have stabilized and that we now have an opportunity to add to jobs on net and not continue to lose jobs. Because ultimately, let's face it, what is economic development about? It's about jobs, 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 jobs. That's everything, jobs. And that's when we'll know, when the employment market stabilizes. So is it in the rearview mirror? It is, but thankfully those initial unemployment claims data come out every week. So we'll be able to follow this, pretty carefully, and we'll know when we hit rock bottom.
Will the construction industry recovery begin in the third or fourth quarter of this year or linger into 2021?
It will linger into 2021. It won't begin when the rest of the economy begins to recover, because we know that construction generally lags the overall economy by 12 to 18 months. And I'm not sure why this time would be different. If anything, the lag would be even greater because vacancy is going to be even greater, and lenders or investors are going to be even more shell-shocked. So credit is going to tighten up even more. I hope I'm wrong about that. The one caveat to that is if we get an infrastructure-oriented stimulus package of some size. Because infrastructure, of course, that triggers more construction directly, but indirectly when you have infrastructure improvements, roadway improvements, or whatever it happens to be, interchanges constructed, that also generates more commercial construction, as it turns out, because more projects become economical, supported by better infrastructure. So, so if we get a massive infrastructure package, and we might, right? We're going to have a presidential election in November, and it would not surprise me if the next president says, I want infrastructure. Because there's going to be a point, Kevin, at which we've had put all the stimulus into the economy. The initial phase of the recovery is strong, but then people are still left with a lot of debt on their balance sheets, lack of confidence, and the economy could dip again. It could easily be a W, not just a V. So at that point, a new president might want to say, or the existing president might want to say, we need to have an infrastructure package to give this recovery some legs, some sustainability. And that would be very good for construction overall, directly and indirectly.
Where do you see the energy sector, i.e. oil, gas, and power generation going in the future? Pre-COVID-19, the South had a boom on capital projects. Do you see more or less capital expenditures in Q3 and Q4 2020? And what does 2021 look like?
Yeah, I see less or fewer capital projects in the short term, of course. I mean, we had oil prices go negative in May. May's future contract turned negative. Now it's come back. The August futures contract, I think, is now in the mid-30s. But you know, if you think about mid-30s as oil prices, and of course, oil prices have come back up, but they can go back down again. That's still way less than we were pre-crisis when we were on $60 a barrel on oil. Natural gas prices are well less than $2 per million BTU. So when you've got cheap natural gas and cheap oil, it seems to me that you're not going to get a lot of investment in new drilling, in energy infrastructure, so on and so forth. It's just, why would you, if you are a financially strapped energy company, and we're going to see a lot of energy companies go bankrupt because of this, why would I put out more capital, invest in supply capacity? I wouldn't. So I think that part of the marketplace doesn't do very well in 2020, and maybe we start to see some recovery in construction in 2021. But a lot of firms use oil and natural gas as inputs to production. And I really believe this story about reshoring of manufacturing back to America, I believe in that story. I don't believe in that story just because I want to believe in that story. I think that if you look at surveys of CEOs, if you look at the global supply chain interruptions that many people have suffered, if they are producing much of what they produce in China, for instance, if you look at the intellectual property issues that are created when you do business in China, I think a lot of American CEOs, unlike the CEOs of 3 decades ago, who said, China or bust. If I'm not producing in China, I'm not profit maximizing. I'm going to China. That's the promised land. Now I think I got to get away from China. I got to bring production back to North America. I got to take advantage of the new USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement. So because of deep energy prices and the desire to bring back more supply chain to America, you might see actually quite a bit of investment in new manufacturing facilities, which of course could be another benefit to contractors in your space.
Here's a good one. The model predictions for COVID deaths were over 250,000 deaths in the US if we did everything right. They have been proven wrong by data so far, and thank God. What is the chance that the economic models would be just as wrong, and parenthetically, only 36% of the predicted retraction, question mark?
Yes, of course. Look, it's no secret that economists can't predict anything. That's not a secret. I mean, is that a secret to anybody out there? As an economist, when I put forward forecasts, are you not taking this with a grain of salt? I hope you are. The good news is that with respect to the COVID-19 deaths, you might remember that earlier this year, we had a sense that the death rate from infection was much higher than it turned out to be. And it's because we didn't fully realize that you could be asymptomatic and be infected with COVID-19. And look, in Maryland, we've had 40,000 cases in Maryland. 40,000 cases in Maryland, right? Confirmed cases. We've had 2,000 deaths. The death rate from that computation is around 5%, right? 5% of the people who got it died. But we know the death rate is a fraction of that. So we've got a lot of undiagnosed people floating around there in the United States and globally. The number of cases is much greater. So that's why the death rate turned out not to, the deaths turned out not to be as great. It's because we thought the lethality of this was much greater than it is. And so could I be wrong as an economist? Might we recover even faster? Or might I be wrong about the V shape? Might it be an L shape? Yeah, of course it could be wrong. But I've tried to provide your stakeholders with some detail regarding history, logic, to say why I think the recovery is going to be the way it's going to be. The initial phase will be quite strong. Then we'll have a period of uncertainty when we could slip back into recession. But of course, government policy might step in and allow this expansion to have some legs, especially if we invest in infrastructure at that time.
All right. Well, let me just check the queue one more time. Most of them you've already answered relative to a second wave impacting the V shape. Final words, final predictions, final thoughts. Give us something to hang on to here, because I've had people text me that they've gotten their 45 out. They're standing on the edge of a ledge. Give us something to hang on to here, Anirban.
Well, let me just say this. You spend good money for that 45. To drink it all down. And then get off that ledge and get another one from the fridge and drink that one down. And then tomorrow's Friday.
All right. Well, we just, bear with me. We just got a couple quick last ones here. Actually, they're kind of pouring in. Are there any economic lessons that we can learn through this pandemic that we can leverage to help us attract younger people to the industry? Example, construction is essentially, for the most part, equal to, that is a good thing, which is equal to work in our industry. Can we leverage this to attract better clientele to our industry?
100%. 100%. Look, so all this talk about social distancing, all this loss of retail jobs, all this loss of jobs in many, many industries. So construction is going to come back. This is an opportunity to recruit young people into the industry. And by the way, there's a sea change taking place in American education. Before, American education was about what? College preparedness and college. That's the only path to the middle class, only path to success. Nonsense. For a lot of kids, it's been a dead end in terms of a lot of college debt and a job at the end of that college career that didn't require a college education in the first place, right? Some of our favorite baristas, went to a four-year university. Okay. And being a barista is hard work. It just doesn't pay that well. Now, there's an opportunity for people to find a different path. And a lot of educators are saying we have to reintroduce vocational training into our high schools. We have to put more money into our two-year colleges. We have to have a better connection between education and career preparedness and actual jobs. So yeah, there's an opportunity for construction to attract a lot of younger people in. And I think educators are more open than they used to be to have people who work in construction or the skilled trades generally to come into classrooms and say, this is an opportunity for you to enter the American middle class, to have the American dream, to buy a home in your 20s without taking on the risk of a lot of college debt.
Do you see, it's interesting analysis because a lot of the members, young members, are early home buyers for obvious reasons. Do you see the federal government and state governments having the stomach to finally invest in crumbling infrastructure, putting people back to work?
Oh, I think so. I mean, we've been talking about infrastructure package for years, right? $1 trillion package, $1.5 trillion package, so on and so forth. We've been talking about it for years. We haven't done anything.
Right.
We haven't raised the gas tax. We know our infrastructure is broken. We get the report every 4 years from the American Society of Civil Engineers that grades our infrastructure. Last time was a 2017 report, a D+. So we know that we have crumbling bridges and all the rest of it. We have just dams, fail in Midland, Michigan, or near Midland, Michigan, right? I mean, that's infrastructure, isn't it? It happens all the time around us. Yeah. So bridge collapse in Minnesota, bridge collapse in Washington State several years ago. So yeah, I think we have the stomach for it. But look, we're in a country where we can't even do the right things because we're so partisan. This is not the time when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would go to Georgetown after a Friday legislative session to have some drinks, right? One's hard drinking Democrat, one's a movie actor from California, couldn't be more different politically. They come together because they're Americans, doing the Americans' work. We don't have that anymore. But do they have the stomach for it? Yeah, we're going to see. We're going to have an election in November. We're going to have a new set of legislators. And hopefully politics will become less toxic in America, because it can't become any more toxic, could it? I don't know. Maybe it can.
Amen. Well, Anirban, that wraps up our session. Very well done as usual. Thank you for your astute economic analysis. And again, to the rest of the audience, this presentation and others directed at this crisis are found at impact-net.org. Stay tuned for future subject matter experts to impart their knowledge, and stay safe, stay well, and be well. Take care. Thanks again, Anirban.
Thank you, Kevin.